Welcome to our Nature Forward's Conservation Cafe on data centers, getting Maryland and Virginia to take action. And I am so excited for tonight's speaker, Julie Bolthouse of the Piedmont Environmental Council. For those of you who don't know, January 8th this year is a special day. It is a day where our General Assemblies for Maryland and Virginia kick off. It's where a lot of the state legislation will go into effect when laws are made. So while Virginia has had some water issues that are delaying their General Assembly from actually having committees this week, both sessions have officially kicked off. So I'm so excited to then have Julie share with us some things we can focus on and knowledge, and then we can have our Maryland and Virginia conservation advocates share some information so that everyone here can get activated on really looking to make a change, whether it is giving comment on the bills that we will keep you updated on through Nature Forward or through wonderful organizations such as Piedmont Environmental Council. We want you to be activated this session for both Maryland and Virginia, wherever you're coming from. So thank you for being here and taking step number one to learning about this issue. So before we get started, I just wanted to just lay in some ground rules. I think for the next slide, this is our agenda for tonight. So we're 5 minutes into the welcome session. Most of the time for tonight until about 8 p.m. Will be Julie's to talk about the very important issues of data centers and how we all can take action. After 8, shortly after her presentation, we will then have our Nature Forward's Maryland and Virginia advocates. You can see here Renee Grebe and Angie McCarthy give you some updates of what to expect specifically for Maryland and Virginia. And then we will pass it over to you for some questions and the answers that we can give to your questions. Now, for questions specifically, oh yes, follow us on social media, Nature Forward, at Go Nature Forward for Instagram, and at Go Nature Forward for X, formerly known as Twitter. And I believe next slide we should have. So before I pass it over to Julie, I will ask that for this session, there is a lot of information to go through. Julie is bringing us so much information. And I will ask that if you have a question, please add that question to the Q&A button on your screen. And then those of us at Nature Forward will monitor those questions. We want Julie to be able to get through her presentation in a timely manner so that everyone can get the information. And then after the presentation, we will share those questions with Julie and our advocates so that they can answer your questions during that Q&A session after 8 o'clock. So please, if you have any questions, add them to the Q&A. If you feel, hey, I only know how to use the chat in Zoom, that's all good. Our advocates and tech support for Nature Forward, we got you. We'll still track them. We won't lose your question. But if possible, if you can identify the Q&A button in the webinar, please add your question there. Okay, so I'm so pleased to welcome Julie Bolthouse for our speaker tonight. Julie is the Director of Land Use at Piedmont Environmental Council, where she's worked for 14 years. She holds a bachelor's in fisheries science with a minor in watershed management and two master's degrees in urban affairs and planning and natural resources. So she's not an overachiever at all. And that's perfect for her advocacy work, where she's worked on a variety of land use issues for the past decade. And especially in the past 3 years, she's focused primarily on data centers and the growing data center market in Virginia, and the enormous expansions of the state's energy infrastructure to serve it. So Julie and Piedmont Environmental Council are primarily focused in Virginia, but as many of you may know, and if you don't know, you definitely will learn on this call, these issues, and as one of our attendees said, living in Data Center Alley, they affect all of us in Virginia and Maryland, and there are a number of those issues we're going to talk about tonight. So I am so excited to pass the floor over to Julie. Thank you, Julie, for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate being given the opportunity to speak tonight. So I'm going to go ahead and share my slides. Let me know if you can't see them. But as Lydia said, I'm with Piedmont Environmental Council. I'm the Director of Land Use. And what I'm going to be speaking to you about today is data centers and getting Maryland and Virginia to take action on the impacts that we're seeing within our communities. First, I want to just start out with what is a data center. Okay, so let's just start out with the basics. These have changed over time, and data centers used to be much smaller than they are today. So back in 2000, we had data centers. They were like 10,000 square foot buildings, or they were the large server rooms in an office building. But they've gotten larger and larger as we've gotten more and more digital data, because that's what happens inside of these facilities. At this point, we're at hyperscale data center size. It's the way, that's kind of the term that's thrown around. But basically what that means is 200,000 square foot plus buildings. That's, for context, much larger than a Walmart supercenter. Walmart supercenters are about 180,000 square foot buildings. And so these facilities are massive. They're usually windowless, and their concrete construction really resemble a warehouse. As you can see in this image here, there's a lot of stuff that you see on the building. On the top, very often you'll see cooling equipment, and that's HVAC, cooling towers, things like that on top of the facility. Sometimes you'll also see, electrical infrastructure or generators and things like that in different formations, but there's always electricity to the building because there's a lot of power demand from these buildings. Each one can use as much as a city's worth of power. And yes, you heard that correct. A single building can use as much as a small city worth of power. And we've got hundreds of these buildings already existing in Virginia, and many, many more proposed. And so that it demands a lot of electricity. And many of these facilities, because of the amount of electricity that they demand, might have a substation near them. That's those large electrical fenced in like squares that you probably have seen occasionally driving down the road, where transmission lines will be coming out of them. So they very often need to have a substation, but then to bring the power to the building itself, that substation then has distribution lines coming from those larger transmission lines that go to these electric utility boxes and underground to the building to power all that IT infrastructure and the cooling equipment. Then you also have backup power generation for the facility, because they have to ensure zero downtime, or they feel they have to ensure zero downtime. And so they use mostly tier 2 diesel generators. Tier 2 means that they have less pollution controls on these generators, so they don't have like SCRs or catalytic converters, things that would reduce the pollution that's coming out of them. And they have a whole lot of them. As you can see in this picture, this is an Amazon data center, and it has dozens of these generators. Each one is about 2 megawatts worth of power. So if these buildings are using 50 megawatts, a city's worth of power, these generators are backing up that much power. They have to be run for maintenance purposes on a regular basis, each one individually over the course of a 365-day year. They have to be run to make sure that they will be in working condition if there is an outage. They also would cut on if there was an outage. We have very, very, very few outages because most of these data centers are directly served by a substation, so transmission lines, and so they're not knocked out by things like trees falling on them, like distribution lines might be. And so you have very few outages. And so we really haven't had the experience of a lot of these generators cutting on at a single moment in time. But if there were a voltage collapse, like what has happened in, for example, the ice storm in Texas last year, or the major outage up in New York a few years back, that sort of thing would cause a whole bunch of generators to cut on at once. And that brings us to the fuel supply that's also on site at many of these facilities. They usually have diesel fuel for like a 48-hour runtime available on site. They also have security to ensure that no one is getting into the facility and causing any problems or stealing data. Now, why are we building so many of these big concrete, warehouses for data? Because these concrete warehouses are holding, storing data from things like this Zoom meeting that we're doing right now, and they're processing all of that data that we use every day when we use our phones and use our email and everything else. So there's a lot of digital demand from just cloud storage, use of our apps and technology, advanced smartphone technology, expansion for rural broadband, digitization of all our materials, and just the Internet of Things. That's like your refrigerator, being able to communicate with it by app, things like that. But one of the biggest pushes that we're seeing in this, the reason we've had such a boom over the last 2 years for data centers is because of generative AI. That's your large language models and probably the advertisements that you've seen for AI assistants and things like that, ChatGPT, all of those is what's pushing this new demand for data centers. It's still questionable how much of that is real and how much of that is hype. And what I mean by that is we are definitely seeing massive investments from companies into building these facilities, and they are absolutely building them. The question is, are they going to actually be able to monetize the product and, make it so that they're actually they use all of the capacity that they're getting approved in these localities. Right now, Virginia has the largest data center market in the world. It's twice as large, more than twice as large as the next one down, which is Beijing. And so most of that capacity in Virginia is in Northern Virginia, mostly in Data Center Alley, Loudoun County, although Prince William is very quickly catching up, and they've been building a whole lot of data center capacity. A lot of what you see constructed right now is actually not online yet because they're not able to get power from the transmission infrastructure. There's a bunch of projects, which we'll talk about a little bit in a few minutes, that are going through the process of getting approved and being constructed. This is just a map from the Virginia Economic Development Partnership showing all of the different data center companies that operate in Virginia, and it's basically all of them. I mean, anyone who is anyone, this is like the Wall Street of data centers, and so anyone who's anyone has a data center in Northern Virginia. All these data centers consume a lot of energy, like I mentioned before, a city's worth of energy, and they are served directly, usually by transmission lines. So not your wooden pole type distribution lines, but these larger ones you see in the picture here. And that power has to come from somewhere. And so it can come from renewables, but what we're seeing is a big push for natural gas right now to serve all this data center capacity. This is from an article that came out a few months ago, actually, just showing how much of the share of electricity in each state goes towards data centers. And you can see that Virginia vastly surpasses any other state with 25% of our power going to data centers. So that means that 25% of our infrastructure is solely needed to serve the data center development in our state. And then a lot of that power is not even coming from within our state. It's actually coming from outside of our state. So this is from another article from the EIA where they were pointing out that Virginia has the top net electricity import of any other state, even California, which brings in a lot of their power from outside of the state. And so if you look at this map, you can see where most of our power winds up coming from. It's West Virginia and Pennsylvania, because everyone else around us is also importing most of their power, which is concerning because Ohio has its own growing data center market. Maryland has its own growing data center market. And so there is demand from other states, from these net export states like West Virginia and Pennsylvania. And also, I'd point out that West Virginia, a lot of their power is still from coal. So you're not getting clean energy from those states either. So this is a graphic that is associated with the regular yearly forecast that's put out by PJM. So PJM is our regional transmission operator. They're the ones who coordinate the sale and market of electricity, basically, of all the utilities. Make sure that we have electricity in the marketplace and that there's a competitive marketplace for that electricity to ensure the reliability of our power as well. So each year they do a forecast and the utilities submit their information. And this is from 2024. Our forecast, that gray line at the bottom, is the power that we've been using in the Dominion area. And we have a peak right now of 22 gigawatts. It's actually 23. It went up a little bit this year too. So I think we're actually at like 23, 24 gigawatts. And we're looking at 23 gigawatts worth of growth by 2039. And so that means that we're going to double our energy infrastructure, an infrastructure system that's taken over 100 years to build, and we're going to double it within 15 or so years. That is an incredible feat if we were able to even do it, but it also has huge ramifications. Now, just for perspective, that growth is not due to anything really except for data centers. If you took out data centers and you just looked at the energy demands from EVs, for example, you can see on this chart, this is a graph or research that was done by the Joint Legislative and Audit and Review Commission of Virginia. So this is the General Assembly Study Commission. They did research on what the demand from data centers looks like going into the future. And you can see that no data center demand winds up with only a 15% growth. That's mainly from EVs. That's from bringing EVs online and electrification of gas heating systems, things like that. Everything else, the doubling of our demand, is all from data center growth. So currently, right now, we have 57 million square feet of data centers constructed in the state, or under construction. So they're either existing or under construction. There's another 189 million square feet of data center space approved, though, or in the pipeline for approval. And so what that means is that that number that we were just looking at in that forecast may not even include much of what's in this 189 million that's in the pipeline. So this is a graph that, or a map that we've been collecting data for the state and putting up onto our website so that people can follow what's happening in Virginia. All of these red dots, so the pink dots are the existing data centers. So that's the 57 million I just mentioned. All these red dots are that 189 million square feet. And the proposals for new data center projects just keep coming, even though the energy demand is so daunting, and the impacts that we're seeing on the ground in our communities is so it's really causing a lot of problems. It's resulting in people having to have their land seized through eminent domain for the transmission line infrastructure, or it's resulting in the degradation of our recreational spaces, our creek corridors, our trails, things like that is what's being used to route a lot of these transmission lines. So it's having huge implications, but yet they keep coming. And so back in 2023 is when the lines that are on this map were approved to expand the transmission infrastructure to get more power to that core area of Northern Virginia where a lot of this data center growth is happening. So the brown lines and the red lines going up into Maryland, those were the ones that were approved in 2023, and the brown is an expansion of the existing right of way. So it basically means they're taking more land in areas that already have transmission lines going through them. And then the red line is the Maryland reliability project, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. That is a new line going through rural parts of Maryland and has huge impacts on historic resources, agricultural resources, and communities. Now, that is only the tip of the iceberg, though, because now that only delivers enough power to really get them to a certain point. It definitely doesn't meet the energy needs of all these new red dots. It's nowhere near that. But just to get them to the next step, which is 8 years out, they are looking at building 765 kV lines. This would be the largest transmission lines we've ever seen in our region. So there are no 765s in the Dominion territory. If you went out to Pennsylvania or into Ohio area, you would see more of those in the AEP utility zone. But these are massive transmission lines, and you can see where they are going. They're going mostly to existing coal plants in West Virginia. One of them is dropping down towards Lynchburg, towards the North Anna nuclear plant, and gas plants that are being proposed down in Southern Virginia, like the Chesterfield plant. You also will note on this map that the retirement of some of these coal facilities has been delayed since the announcement of the transmission lines happened. So in actually, I guess we'll talk about that a little bit more in a future slide. Sorry, I forgot I put it later on. But we've actually seen First Energy delay the retirement of 2 of their coal facilities. Now, Dominion has what really backs up all of this energy growth and their justification for these transmission lines and the justification for all the generation facilities is these contracts that are behind all these projects. And it's what is given to PJM to justify them including them in their analysis. And these contracts are not reviewed by any other entity besides the utility and the customer. So that's the data center company. And so what we're looking at here is electric service agreements. That's basically they've got everything and they're ready to flick the switch on and go, all the way down to your substation engineering letter of agreement, which is what the SELOA one is, which basically means they're routing the transmission line. They're looking at where the substations would be. But once they are in these agreements, the applicant, the data center company, is actually put some money into the game. And so there is some commitment here. And that's what's really alarming, is that we've gone from 16 gigawatts of contracted capacity within these electric contracts to 21 gigawatts in contract. That's 5 gigawatts worth of growth in just 1 year, with no oversight from the state. The state isn't able to review these to determine if they're consistent with the Virginia Clean Economy Act, if we're going to be able to serve this with clean power, what the impact is going to be on the ratepayers of building out all this infrastructure. No one's reviewing if we can even create that much power and deliver that much power by the timelines that have been set by the utility and the customer. Now, who's signing these contracts? It's actually being signed by Dominion. It's Dominion's service area, but it's also your co-ops within those service areas. So Novec, ODEC, REC, all of those co-ops within Virginia, which provide power within certain areas of Northern Virginia and out into other parts of the state, they are actually seeing they're a significant portion of this load growth. And what's alarming is that they're not actually subject to the Virginia Clean Economy Act. So the impact that they're having on our climate goals isn't even really part of the calculus when we're looking at things like Dominion's Integrated Resource Plan and other documents like that. So what is the impact on you and I? Well, a lot of these infrastructure costs are being passed on to the ratepayer in two forms. And one of those is the risk, because as I mentioned earlier, these companies don't even really have a firm grasp of how they're going to monetize a lot of this hype that has been building up around AI. They have a lot of ideas of how they're going to use AI and how they're going to make money from it, but they don't really have a firm business plan for the amount of capacity that they're actually building. And so there's a huge risk that they are actually over building and that those buildings won't be filled with servers. And if that were to happen and we build out the infrastructure, we build out the transmission lines and the substations, all of that winds up falling onto the ratepayers. So that's one risk. And the secondary risk of the cost falling on ratepayers is just simply the way that we put out the cost for transmission lines and substations. They're allocated across the entire rate base, so everybody pays some portion for those new transmission lines because it's considered a part of the common grid that everybody supposedly benefits from, even if those transmission lines are going directly to a data center and that substation is solely serving a single data center. And this is from the Dominion Integrated Resource Plan. It's their required residential bill projection out to 2039. And what they showed was that since 2019, when a lot of this growth started, the projected bill is going to go up $192 to $315 per 1,000 kilowatt bill, residential bill per month. That's 158% increase over 20 years and has a significant impact, especially on low income households. Now, this also threatens, all this data center growth is also threatening our environmental progress in the state. So land consumption is a huge aspect. We're not only using it for the data centers themselves, but the land is being consumed by the power generation and the storage that needs to be put into place. So that's your battery storage systems, that's the hydro dams for storage. It's also your transmission lines. It's any kind of power generation facility. You have fragmentation from those transmission lines, which is a type of land consumption, but also has, invasive species introductions and issues with it as well. And then you have the data centers themselves. And so I mentioned 189 million square feet. That's equivalent to 1,000 Walmart supercenters. And that's pushing out, that development is pushing out other types of development from our community. So the planned mixed use developments and housing that we would like to have, areas near our metro are being filled with data centers. And so those other uses need to move out somewhere else. And so it's inducing sprawl into areas not as appropriate for or beneficial for the types of uses that we would like to have there. So like near metro, we would like to have mixed use and housing. We also are seeing massive water quality impacts. And this is a sign from Maryland about the contamination that was a result of Quantum Loop dewatering their facility and pumping that water into a nearby stream and then putting up these ridiculous signs instead of getting the permits that they were supposed to. But we are also seeing indirect use of water. So this is going more into that water supply aspect. So we're having water quality impacts, but we're also seeing a lot more consumption. And it's not just consumption for cooling, which is consumed through the cooling of the IT equipment. It's evaporated out through cooling towers. Not all data centers use a lot of water, but some do. And the ones that do have huge usually huge amounts of water that they're using. And so that can have a lot of impact on groundwater supply or surface water, depending on where it's coming from. But you also have the indirect use of water, and that's for your gas plants and other type of power generation facilities that might be using water for cooling. Nuclear would be another example. In Loudoun County, we've seen that the reclaimed water system, which most of the data centers were hooked up to initially, has been basically increased as much as it can be at this point. And they've moved more towards potable water, especially as they've moved away from that corridor that's served by the reclaimed water system. And that potable water usage has now surpassed the reclaimed water usage and has increased by 250%. We're also seeing impacts on our recreational facilities, and this is the Washington and Old Dominion Trail, and this is a corridor that has been heavily impacted by data centers, by substations and transmission lines overhead. But we also have these massive data center proposals like the one in Prince William County called Digital Gateway. This was a largest proposal I know of in the world that's been approved, 22 million square feet of data center development. So it was 40 plus buildings. It had, I think, 14 substations. Don't quote me on these numbers. I'm just remembering off the top of my head here. But it was it's a massive development, and it's under suit right now. I think the residents of Heritage Hunt and American Battlefield Trust are trying to see if they can get that approval reversed. But that had huge impacts on a rural area that was planned to be rural, has a lot of historic resources in it, has, I think, 8 cemeteries located within it, a lot of African American history, I think an old schoolhouse, and it's obviously between the Manassas National Battlefield Park and Conway Robinson State Forest. And so that's going to have a significant impact on the viewshed and the air quality and water quality of those parks. And we're also seeing lots of violations because a lot of this development is moving so fast that the construction is happening without much oversight. And you're seeing things like this damage to cemeteries and just degrading of resources that were supposed to be protected and wind up being destroyed in the process. And basically they pay their fines and move on. And then you've got air quality impacts from the emergency backup power and the primary power generation facility. So first, let's talk about those diesel generators that we mentioned at the beginning. We have 4,000 of those generators permitted in Northern Virginia in very close proximity to residential and recreational facilities. So that green line that's going through the map, that's the Washington and Old Dominion Trail. And these red dots are showing the large ones are up to 200 generators. That's the equivalent of 11 gigawatts. What we were able to pull through the air permits that have been filed since 2023. We have not pulled 2024 yet and calculated it out yet, but that's 11 gigawatts worth of power, which is comparable to all the generation owned by Dominion. We're also seeing an increase, though, on the use of natural gas turbines, and these are being used full-time 24/7 because the data centers are unable to get power from the grid. So they're using it to supplement some operations until they can get that power from the grid. So this is a Vantage data center in Sterling that has a permit for 100 megawatts worth of natural gas. And in an interview with CNBC, they said that they are fully off of the grid and running off of these turbines. And of course, this is accelerating. If you look at the stock market and you follow all the news about natural gas, this has been boosting natural gas significantly, and it's accelerating these projects in Virginia. Finally, we got the climate impacts. And so there's three different major climate areas that are impacted by data center development. There's scope one, which is just like the climate impacts that are caused by things on site. So that would be your generators mostly. And then you've got scope two, and that's the climate impact from the power that is coming into the facility. So that's power purchased from the utility. And then scope three, which I'm not going to get into because it's so unwieldy, but that's everything else. That's the carbon impact. So that's the concrete, that's the transportation costs of the construction crew, it's the waste generated, it's all of that stuff. And that's massive, of course. But scope two, let's talk about that for a second. Where is Dominion Power's power coming from? 1/3 of it's coming from nuclear, 1/3 of it is coming from natural gas, and 26% of it is coming from coal, and a lot of that is from West Virginia. I think there's still some coal operational in Southwest Virginia as well. I think there's two facilities. That means that a lot of the energy usage, especially when you're building out transmission lines to these areas that are primarily coal, is increasing. We're significantly increasing the climate impact. And you'll note on here again, these two, Harrison and Fort Martin, are the first energy sites that were delayed just a couple years, I think it was last year actually, when First Energy announced that it was ditching its 2030 climate goal. And then you also see Brandon Shores unable to retire because they are in desperate need of that power. And then you've got not just the delayed retirement of coal facilities, but you're also seeing new gas facilities like the Chesterfield plant that has been proposed in Southwest Virginia. So just quick summary, the explosive growth of data centers requires massive amounts of energy and energy infrastructure. That's creating a huge burden on our air, water, grid, community, and it's threatening Virginia's clean energy future and the environment. And the cost of that infrastructure is being unfairly borne by existing ratepayers. Now, in response to all of this, in 2023, the General Assembly did move forward a study of data centers. Like I mentioned before, the Joint Legislative Audit and Review Commission, study arm of the General Assembly, they did a study on what is the impact of data centers in the state. And their conclusions were that the energy demand is immense and that it was going to be difficult to very difficult. And this is not an agency that is prone to hyperbole. They are very judicious in any type of statement that they would say like this. And so for them to say difficult to very difficult, in my mind, basically means impossible to completely impossible to provide with or without the VCEA. So that means that it's not the VCEA making it so they can't meet the energy demands. The energy demands are so high that they just simply can't meet them, that it's becoming extremely difficult to even meet them. What we would need to meet the energy demand, and this is just the half of the capacity, we'd need 2 times as fast of build out of solar that as we've had in the past. We'd need wind capacity that exceeds the potential capabilities of all offshore wind sites that have been identified. We'd need 1.5 gigawatts of gas every 2 years for 15 years. We'd need significantly increased battery storage. We'd need to add 2.7 new gigawatts of nuclear. That's more than the North Anna site. And increase imported energy by 54% to up to 54% or 146%. 8%. So we got to get more power from West Virginia or Pennsylvania or one of these other places. And they did find that that level of growth would have an impact on ratepayers into the future due to, like we mentioned before, all the generation and infrastructure, transmission infrastructure. This is just the graphic that they've used in their report demonstrating just how much has to come from these different sources. So you can see carbon is your gas, and it ranges from 10 megawatts up to 19 of gas facilities that we would have to add. And we'd have to build somewhere between 16 and 30 gigawatts worth of solar and wind. That's a lot more than we have currently. And then the other conclusions that they drew from the report were that the on-site generators had a minimal impact currently. The thing that I found really concerning about that, though, is they were saying it had a minimal impact statewide. They don't really look at the localized effects. They didn't look at new permits that are in the pipeline for all the new data center growth. And they don't look at the fact that we're seeing more natural gas turbines for 24 power or 24/7 power. They acknowledge that some data centers use significant amounts of water, and that growth should or could be better managed by having the localities or allowing the localities to ask for water usage information up front and ensure that adequate water supplies are available. They said this was actually really good. They said that data centers are industrial in nature, and they did recommend that they should not be located near residential schools or parks. And they warn that data centers can have noise impacts depending on the type and equipment used, and recommended that localities be authorized to ask for noise studies. So PEC, along with MPCA, created a couple years ago a group called the Data Center Reform Coalition. And so we helped to push forward that study that was done in 2023. But we're also getting ready for responding to this General Assembly session in 2025. And the results from that JLARC study are really helping us to form bills and a really strong foundation, which we call the 4 pillars of data center reform. And so this is what we are pushing as we go into the General Assembly. Enhanced transparency, not just around local reporting for proposed data centers, like tell us how much water, energy, and emissions you're going to use when you propose a data center, but also statewide reporting on existing data centers so that we have information about how much they're currently using for better planning going forward. Also, state oversight, establishing a state review and permitting process that looks at the grid impacts, the air and water impacts, the regional impacts that may not be assessed by the locality, and the impact on ratepayers. And then ratepayer protection, making sure that the industry is paying for their own infrastructure and that cost is not falling onto all the rest of the ratepayers, which would be residential, small businesses, that sort of thing. And then incentivizing sustainability, encouraging data center operators to meet much higher standards for energy and energy efficiency standards, so that they can get the sales use and tax exemption rather than just giving it to any data center that meets the threshold, the hiring and investment threshold. So to that, we're going to have a lobby day on January 20th. We have a bus reserved leaving from Haymarket 5:30 a.m. on January 20th. And we're really excited. We have a full day of meetings that are getting set up with legislators, and we got lunch from Roots. And so if you're available on January 20th, please join us for a data center lobby day so that we can help to push for the reform we need in the data center industry so badly. We know that this infrastructure is necessary for things like we're doing right now, but we have to balance the impacts, because what is the value of having all this storage and processing capability if we don't have clean air and we don't have the secure water supplies we need, and a cost of energy is gone up so much that we can't charge our phone anymore. I'm exaggerating a little bit, but you get my point. We really have to balance the impacts with the benefits that come with data centers. And I would also say we have an unfair share of the burden of data center development in the world. As you saw, Virginia is the largest market in the world, and we're continuing to build at a speed that is faster than most of the rest of the world. So with that, I will actually ask, do you guys want to move into your presentations before we take questions?
Yes, thank you for asking, Julie. So,
Oh, shit.
thank you everyone who has been adding your questions to the Q&A. Keep doing it, keep it up. We are going to update you specifically for Virginia and Maryland. So I think Denise, did you want to share the slides? All right, so I am going to start us off with our Maryland conservation advocate, Angie McCarthy, who has been following this issue closely, both at a local level and looking at what is coming for Maryland General Assembly at the state level. So take it away, Angie.
Thank you, Lydia, and thank you so much, Julie. Again, I'm Andrew McCarthy, and I'm the Maryland Conservation Advocate for Nature Forward. Before I started, I just wanted to empower all of you to follow the legislation that's going to be coming up. A good briefer for that is the Climate Justice Wing's Legislative Summit, which actually happened this past weekend. And if you follow that link, which will be made available to all of y'all after this, they will have some brief slides to talk about the different environmental measures. In addition to that, at the end of this presentation, we will have a QR code where you can sign up for action alerts from Nature Forward, where Renee and I will be able to keep you abreast of any actions that you might be able to take if you're feeling fired up after Julie's presentation, as I am. So first, in terms of what bills to look at and what to support, this General Assembly is going to be the year of energy. And a lot of this is as a reaction to last year's General Assembly, where any sort of regulation that could have taken away business away from data centers was really tamped down from the environmental community and for legislators. And tangentially to that, all of the all of the bills that we are seeing upcoming are going to be regulating data centers through energy. And as Julie said, that's going to be a huge thing. So number one will be a study bill from Senator Karen Lewis Young. And this is going to look at the economic and environmental impacts of data centers in Maryland. It's going to be very similar to the JLARC study, or the Joint Legislative and Regulatory Commission, Audit Regulatory Commission study that Julie talked about in Virginia. The ACE Act from Delegate Charkoudian is going to address resource adequacy, and it's also hoping to increase the amount of in-state generation while protecting ratepayers. The GRID Act is going to require electric companies to develop and submit distribution and investment plans to the PSC, so the Public Service Commission, to forecast load better. And this will kind of help with the projections that Julie was showing, where we're not really sure how we're going to meet this demand at this point. Excuse me. The Cherish Act is actually considering a community's environmental justice score and their current pollution burden before MDE or the Maryland Department of Energy is allowing for new permits. And finally, another bill to keep your eye on is Renew, which requires MDE or the Maryland Department of Environment to quantify costs of climate change and make sure polluters are paying their fair share towards climate resiliency projects. And those are just a handful of bills that are coming up for this General Assembly, which started today at noon, and there'll be plenty more action to go. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Angie. Denise just dropped the link for our action alerts. Maryland General Assembly runs much longer than Virginia's this year. It runs through April. So these are the bills that she's seen coming up. There will be more bills to come on this issue. And it is so important that for my Marylanders on this call, that you are engaged, because last General Assembly, as Angie shared, we had a bill come up out of the blue that gave data centers a special exemption with the diesel generators so that we could attract more to Maryland. And so we want to be ready and we need your help. So with that, I am going to pass it over to Renee, who has the monumental task of coming after Julie, who's the expert in Virginia. But Renee, what do you have to share with us of how we can get activated?
I have to share with you that we are so lucky to have Julie in our state, and we follow a lot of what she and other groups like the Sierra Club are helping to gather in terms of information for us. So you already heard a lot about Virginia. I don't need to spend much time here. We always put out every year a blog post on what we're following at the General Assembly level. Data centers will be very high on that list, probably number one. And we'll highlight a few bills that'll be important to us. As there's so many dropping and there's going to be more coming. And that blog post will hopefully be out in the next week, but it'll be something that will be evolving throughout General Assembly. So everyone here, I'm sure, will get that in their inbox when it comes out, and we'll make sure it's linked from the blog. So just feel free to keep in touch that way. And then, like Julie already mentioned, come down for Data Center Lobby Day. I think I saw a question in the chat about the buses. They'll be coming from Haymarket. Unfortunately, I don't believe there's any from the area that you and I are in, which is more on the eastern side of Northern Virginia, but I can let Julie speak to that a little bit more. But if you can come that day, great. And if not, there's also a second one, which is with our partners at the Virginia Conservation Network in Richmond that Lydia will be going to. I'll be going on the 20th. Lydia is going to be going down the 22nd. And we can talk about data centers then too. So thank you all so much for being here today.
Thank you, Renee. And, it doesn't matter the party or the split in a General Assembly. We can tell you, all of us who have worked on this issue can tell you that this is an issue that needs everyone engaged, because things that you might have predicted before of one party supporting or being against are often flip-flopped, and we need your help to make this a serious issue for these regulations to be passed. So with that, I'm going to go to questions, and I'm actually going to start with the question that Renee referred to just recently about whether there's any other help or bus with transportation for Lobby Day. Julie.
So we are basing transportation on signups. So if you sign up and you have a location we start to see a number of people wanting a bus from, we'll definitely consider another one. But right now, the primary location people are asking to leave from is Haymarket. So that's the only one we've got reserved. And also keep in mind that it is Inauguration Day. And so I have been told by the bus company that I better get my reservations in soon.
So if you're a Virginian and you're able to go, sign up now. Okay. So I'm gonna take us back. Julie, we've had a few questions in our Q&A that kind of refer to driving the need of data centers, if there are ways that we as people should be changing our habits to drive down that need. Is there something larger that's driving it? Should we stop building them? Like, that age-old question.
Okay, so the analogy I really like to use here to help people understand is, think about the automobile, okay? When the automobile first came out, obviously the answer to the impacts that came with it, the pollution from the tailpipe, the lack of seatbelts, I mean, these things were not safe when they first came out, wasn't to make everyone stop driving. It's always good to get people to use mass transit. We always encourage, walking and living close to goods and services so you don't have to drive everywhere. But we know that you can't get away from the automobile. That is how our world has been built here in America, at least in the United States. So the response was from the industry like it was from the top down to the industry. It was regulations that came into play on emission standards, on seatbelt standards, on safety standards, crash testing, and all of those things. That's how all these things were implemented. It wasn't people going, well, these are unsafe, so I'll just stop driving and everyone's just going to stop driving. Like that's not how change happens with this level of, revolutionary technology. And so what I would say is, yes, you should change your habits if you can, be more aware of your data waste. Like for example, we used to record like all of our meetings, our internal meetings, and we were like, why are we doing this? This is wasting tons of cloud storage. It's costing us a ton of money in cloud storage. And so we need to not, do that anymore. So those are the kind of decisions you can make. But on the other hand, it's not all on you. It really has to come from the top down in a regulatory form where our government says these impacts are unacceptable and you've got to figure out a way to serve the demand without having any more than this level of impact. And if you don't do that, then the industry really has no incentive to really innovate. And so that's what I would say is that we're at the point of the automobile, no emission standards, no seatbelts. And we need to say, okay, we need to actually implement some of these regulations and make this industry better, more sustainable within our communities. I don't know if that answers the question, but hope it does.
Any issue is complicated, and data centers is definitely a hugely complicated issue. So thank you for that answer. Another question, is there a danger of overbuilding and leaving Northern Virginia with this attendee, Jackie says, a herd of white elephants?
I do think there's a risk of overbuilding, and I think that truthfully, the risk is probably the least within Data Center Alley because that market is so strong. There's so much fiber, there's so much desire to be in that location. I think the risk is further out. It's going to be the big projects like along the I-95 corridor. Honestly, Quantum Loop, I would throw into that category. I would throw Digital Gateway in that category. Those are the ones that, if the market really starts to falter, that are going to fall first.
Quantum loophole, that's for all of our Marylanders on this call. So okay. The huge buildings that are data centers, especially the hyperscale data centers, is there capacity to require solar panels to be put on all of those flat rooftops?
I love that idea. And what I've been told by the industry is they have a lot of other equipment up there and they can't put, that up there. And even if they were to put solar on the facilities, it would only provide like 1% of their power need. My response is you have more than just your roof. You could possibly put it over some of the equipment, depending on what type of equipment it is. And 1% is something. You have parking lots too, and you have stormwater ponds, and you have other places where you could actually implement in solar as well. And so I would say they should be doing whatever they absolutely can, even if it is 1%, that's 1% less that we have to provide somewhere else.
Thank you. Okay. Can you speak to the weather and climate impacts on data centers? So are data centers during the summer much less efficient when cooling is more difficult and demand is high? And then how much less efficient are local data centers relative to like Norwegian data centers or something like that, where the area is cooler?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I'm not a technical expert on data centers, but my understanding from just reading, data center publications is that those data centers that are in places that are much colder do have much lower cooling energy needs associated with them. The hotter places where you put them, say if you put them in like Arizona, you're using a lot more energy and potentially a lot more water to cool them. I would say Virginia is actually a little bit cooler than many of the other places where they have hot data center markets like Arizona and Texas.
Thank you. Julie, I'm gonna take us to something possibly related to our JLARC study in Virginia. You talked a lot about this study related to the energy. And Carl was wondering, have environmental impact assessments been conducted for building of data centers in Virginia?
So because environmental impact assessments are usually associated with, there has to be a federal nexus to trigger them. So there has to be federal expenditures or there has to be a federal project. I don't know of any data centers that have, unless there's some possibly on Army bases that have that I'm not aware of. But no, they're usually not triggered. I will say though, when they impact more than, I think it's an acre of wetland, they do trigger NEPA review or Section 106 when they impact historic resources. I don't know if that answers. but
That does answer it. And a quick follow-up, you didn't talk a lot about environmental impacts in the JLARC. Were those studied in JLARC, or was there not a lot of information on that?
There wasn't a lot of information on that. So JLARC really had a very short period of time. They only had a year. And honestly, I don't think they had the expertise to go into a lot of the environmental issues. So what they did was they basically talked to the agencies in charge, which is DEQ. And so they basically, asked, does DEQ have concerns? And what you saw reflected in the report was DEQ responding that, we have regulations around the air permits. We have regulations around water, surface water withdrawals and things like that. And therefore, there's a process, and that means there's protections. But we all know how flawed that process sometimes is and why we need better planning and oversight. And so I would say that they didn't dig any further than that.
And another follow-up, would you have any recommendations? For example, for Maryland, Angie mentioned had wanted to do a data center study. Would you have any recommendations for those of us to push in a certain way to get those environmental impacts studied?
Yeah, I would say explicitly ask for them. I would say asking for impacts on water supply and impacts on regional and local air quality, and impacts on the state's climate goals. Our study didn't explicitly ask for those things. It said energy and environmental issues, and it was very vague about environmental issues, and so it was left up to the interpretation of JLARC. You could also identify a specific entity that you think would be best equipped to dig into those issues. Like, honestly, we started out really wanting this to go to the National Academies of Science instead, where the gold mining study had, and I think the uranium mining study had gone several years ago, and we thought they would have been better equipped to dig into that kind of information. Because JLARC is much more focused on economics. They do a lot of analysis of our tax dollars and how well they're being utilized to for economic development purposes.
All right, thank you. We're going to shift to water now. There have been a few questions regarding the different types of cooling from water for data centers. Anne wondered, do data centers use a closed loop water system that could be recirculated? And if it is discharged, it's contaminated, and where does it go?
So that's a lot of questions in one. I will say that yes, some of them do use closed loop water systems. That they vary in their cooling technology. So some of them use all air cooling, some of them use closed loop water, some of them use evaporative cooling, some of them use immersive liquid cooling. And those, for example, immersive liquid, and I'm not sure about the closed loop. I've never actually heard of contaminants being in that, but that might be an issue as well. But I know with immersive cooling, there potentially is PFAS and other things that could be in that discharge. And so that is a growing question. I don't know that there's a lot of information on it yet. I've not really heard that much about it yet. So in a few years, maybe we'll know more. And honestly, I think that we're going to see more of it because air cooling is not enough to keep these new servers that are higher processing capability cool. So we're likely going to see a lot more liquid cooling because liquid carries more heat away than air does.
Thank you, Julie. I want to lift up an article from Christina on a data center that has been given conditional approval in Montgomery County's Ag Reserve. There's also a data center proposed in Dickerson, Maryland, that is proposing withdrawing its cooling water from the Potomac. Now, they're supposed to use a closed loop system where water is not lost. I know you're not an industry expert, but would you be able to explain to us a little more about that closed loop system and why they claim that water is not lost?
So the closed loop system doesn't lose water because it's actually circulating the water through, a closed pipe. My understanding, though, is that it does need to be flushed out periodically and then refilled, and that's like a once a year, once every 6 months process. And so what we've seen in localities is that they have to think about when they allow for that refilling because it is a large quantity of water at a single time. So they should make sure that they're not doing that refilling in, say, like the summer months, when water levels might be low. So I would argue that it probably is not no water loss because I've never heard of a closed loop system that doesn't need to be flushed out periodically and refilled. It depends on the other thing is it depends on what's in that closed loop. If it's some sort of, coolant, I don't know. You have to talk to industry experts if they're using something else, besides just a closed loop water system.
And they do use other things other than just water too.
Yes, they do.
At one conference, one immersive technology place was proposing using mineral oil as a coolant. So all kinds of things, guys. Another question on water, Julie. Can you talk more about where this water is coming from? You talked a little bit earlier in your presentation about reclaimed water versus potable water. Is this all coming from rivers and streams or from aquifers?
Well, all of the water is coming from the water system. And it's all connected, really. I mean, groundwater is really connected to our surface waters. And so, they're really not completely differentiated. But most data centers are running off of municipal water. When you get out into rural areas, they may be pulling directly from a surface water body and then cleaning their own. They might have their own waste or their own water treatment facility. That's pretty rare as far as I've seen. You also have them potentially pulling from groundwater. We've seen that in places like Culpeper, in more rural areas. That's very worrisome because there's much less oversight around groundwater withdrawals. So when we're pulling from groundwater like that, that can be really concerning for the local farmers, and honestly the neighborhoods as well, the households that also have wells. But mostly we're seeing it pulled from municipal water, and municipal water is coming usually from surface water body, reservoir, something like that. Depends on where your municipal supply is coming from.
So for many of us who are getting our municipal supply from like the Potomac or Occoquan, which is connected, this is coming from those areas.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. We're gonna pull back a little bit in our topics. Julie, can you speak to why this area is so desirable for data centers? Is it like because of defense or the federal government, or is there something else that makes it so attractive?
It's us here. They love us. No, it's our fiber lines that were built back in the 90s. MA East was one of the major lines that went through Northern Virginia, and it brought in the first data center development. And the thing about data centers is that they don't just work in a vacuum in their own individual building. They're communicating via fiber lines with each other. And so data centers benefit from being in closer proximity to each other. They also benefit by clustering because they are utilizing the services, the same services, which means you're building up a personnel that is familiar with the construction, the security, the landscaping, whatever protocols of these facilities. The electricians, the plumbers, everything that you need to build these facilities. Those folks are here in Northern Virginia because they've been building, as Buddy Reiser, who's the Economic Development Director for Loudoun County, likes to say, or at least he used to be quoted saying this a lot. We haven't had a single day without data center development in the last 20 years. So we have a lot of expertise in building data centers since the 90s. And so that's one of the reasons. The other benefit of locating here that the other reason they locate here is we have very few natural disasters. We don't have fires. We hardly have earthquakes. I know we had that one. We don't have a lot of, tropical storms or anything like that. Then the last one, what was it? I had it in my head. Oh, price of electricity. Our electricity is not nearly as expensive as some of the other places like California. And so the price of electricity is also really attractive. And then, of course, there's what you mentioned. Proximity to the federal government is very good as well.
Thank you. And speaking of the federal government, with the incoming administration's push for a data center build out, what protections do we have? And I don't know if you know this or not, is there anything that's going on at a federal level that can regulate data centers?
Honestly, no, I see the exact opposite happening. And so you've seen a lot of discussion about pulling back on air quality standards. You've also seen a lot of discussion, and so the reason that matters is because that could enable on-site natural gas generation. And so you could see a lot of these data centers that can't get power from the grid, start their own gas plants to support their power needs, and have less environmental standards to meet potentially. Now, keep in mind though, the states have their own environmental standards. So as long as the state stands strong, federal EPA standards could, be reduced and not necessarily have an impact on, say, Virginia or Maryland if our standards were still strong. But the other thing that you see happening at the federal level is this kind of Cold War era AI arms race. And so there's a lot of discussion about how we need to keep up with AI development in China, and they're building out so fast that, if we slow down at all, or if we don't, accelerate how fast we're building our energy infrastructure and data centers, then we're going to fall behind, and there's going to be this authoritative AI model that is going to threaten democracy. I truthfully don't. I say that because that's what I'm quoting what Sam Altman has said in op-eds in the Washington Post. I honestly don't know what that means though, and I've never really gotten a very good explanation about exactly what that means, because tons of our data goes through other countries on a regular basis. I mean, every time you are using the web, that data, there's dark data collected on you, and it goes all over the world.
How reassuring.
Be careful what you look up on the web.
So as our data travels through the dark web all over the world, Rachel would like to know, are there any benefits to residents in the local area surrounding the data centers?
Benefits from the data centers to local residents?
Yeah, what benefits are
the revenue, I think, is the biggest benefit that localities get from data centers. And that revenue, it comes from not just the property assessment, but also from the machine and tools tax. So, or I guess personal property tax. So it's all of that equipment that's within the facility brings in a lot of tax revenue to localities, depending on what their tax rate is and their depreciation rates and everything like that. But if they set it up well, they get a lot of revenue, which can support, school systems and other things. But as I've been pointing out to folks, there's what localities have to remember is how much are you willing to bring into your community and still stick by what you want your community to be? You know, you have to plan for this infrastructure. I don't think it's terrible for a locality to allow some data center development. In fact, I think especially smaller data center development can fit very well into a locality. It's just a matter of having a plan and not allowing this to just run amok. Again, going back to my car analogy, we just got to put, you know, some standards in place so that we have a safer car that is more sustainable and that helps to benefit our communities.
And since we're on the topic of tax revenue, Dan is wondering, where can we find the tax generation and impact cost info? And I do realize that this may change and you are focused in Virginia. So that may look very different than Maryland.
Yeah, so the tax revenue from data centers is going to vary widely. Like I said, it really depends on what the locality has set up as their tax rate and then as their depreciation schedule. And then it depends on if they've put incentives in place. Some localities, especially rural localities, trying to attract data centers, give them, you know, like a tax break for the first 3 years or something. So it really varies from locality to locality significantly.
Yes, and I will say, Dan, as well, for Maryland, the split between state and localities is different than the tax split between Virginia and its localities. So it varies widely, as Julie says. Okay, Julie, we're gonna get into some nitty-gritty electricity demand questions, and then everyone, we'll have one room for two more questions, and then we will have to finish with some announcements. But so Julie, there's a question regarding electricity demand for data centers as it continues to outpace our ability to generate that electricity. It seems we'll be forced into higher prices. More fossil fuels will be generated, maybe roaming blackouts. Let's hope not, but maybe. With all of those things, it seemed like that chart that you shared earlier in your slides, our attendee, Darian, I apologize if that was an incorrect pronunciation. There was 158% rise over 20 years, which doesn't seem a lot per year. Do you think that assessment is accurate? Can you go into more depth on why you feel this is alarming?
Okay, so first of all, I would say that they did not incorporate inflation into that estimate. So that doesn't include inflation. The other thing is that I would say it's very likely an underestimate because the Dominion IRP, and this is actually something we don't have a lot of clarity around. So I'm telling you one of the things we're concerned about. I don't know because we haven't been able to research it, but it's not completely clear to me if that are the estimate that they put forward actually included the co-ops in the infrastructure that would, or the generation and infrastructure that would be necessary to get the power to them. So if you remember the co-op graph I showed you, half of the data center load is actually in Novec territory, which is a co-op, which if that is not actually in their RPS that Dominion has put forward, because the integrated resource plan is only for the Dominion service area, not their transmission zone. So anyways, that means that it might not actually include all of that co-op generation need and transmission need. And so that means that it's probably drastically an underestimate of how much we will actually need to build out. The other thing is this does not consider the fact that we might not actually be able to import what they are projecting we would be able to import. Because if you look at the details of where all this power would come from that estimate, it talks about a 20% increase in importation. So it's not completely clear we'll actually be able to import that power, because it's not clear that with all the decommissioning of coal facilities that's happening, which is a good thing, I would argue, that we'll actually be able to buy more power from West Virginia. You also have everyone else demanding more power at the same time. So you have Columbus, Ohio, that has a booming data center market. You have Maryland that has a growing data center market. And so they're also going to be demanding more power. And there's also a global rise in demand for power. And what that means is that the transformer prices are going to go up. All the stuff that is needed to build out all this infrastructure, the prices are going to go up because the demand is so high across the world. And so I would argue that it's probably a pretty big underestimate, but we point to it because we need some evidence to show what we know is going to happen. We know there's going to be an increase on the amount that regular ratepayers are paying. And Dominion has admitted this much. We know it's going to be more, but they've at least admitted this much, and that's why I point to it.
Great, thank you. And finally, our last question is, can you review again from your slide some of the specific recommendations you have for minimizing or reducing the environmental impact for data centers, and especially in an area, I realize you're in Virginia, but just some general recommendations, you know, even for Maryland, where we have very pro data center executive wing. What specific recommendations do you have for regulating data centers and encouraging additional renewable capacity? Yes.
I think the absolute first step is transparency, because right now so much of this is happening in a black box that we don't even know how much power they're demanding. We don't know how much water they're using. We don't know until the generators are operating how much emissions impact they're going to have. And so we need information up front, and that's why the first pillar of our 4 pillars is transparency. The other thing that I would say is really critically important is to have, once you get that information about energy up front, to have information about what infrastructure is going to be necessary to serve it. And so we have realistic planning happening at the state and regional level around power generation and infrastructure capacity, and how that power is going to be how it's going to be consistent with the rest of the state policy. So are we going to minimize our carbon impacts, and how are we going to do that? The last thing I would say from a very local standpoint, our localities really need to be demanding more from the data centers in terms of sustainability. Like, the commitment to renewables on site should just be a no-brainer. They should all have some renewable. They should have geothermal. They should have solar integrated in. They should have different aspects that they are meeting that help to enhance their sustainability. There's a variety of different things that they could do, but that's also what we need to see at the local level.
All right. Thank you so much, Julie, for your time, for your expertise, for answering all those wonderful questions. Denise, do you want to share that last slide? We have a few announcements in addition to the Virginia lobby days that are coming up on the 20th and the 22nd. I want to reiterate, if you can't travel, that's okay. If you're not a Virginia resident, that's okay, because you can still join us and be engaged in this battle for stronger data center regulations through Action Network. So please, 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 this is our sign up with Nature Forward through Action Network. Our advocates who you just met tonight, Denise, Renee and Angie, are going to be following the General Assembly closely, sending updates, sending opportunities for you all to write to your state legislator in support of or in opposition to bills. We'll be updating our conservation blog as well. And if you want to learn even more about data centers, this is not our first and only presentation on data centers. We have one on data centers, how data centers impact our land and parks and water, from Kyle Hart from NPCA. We have a very in-depth Data Center 101 from Virginia Sierra Club member Ann Bennett. Those are all available for at our natureforward.org/conservation cafe. A link was dropped in the chat as well to give us feedback. We try to tailor our conservation cafes to your feedback. We weren't able to get to all the questions today. So we would love, you can drop it in the form. You can also send your questions if you're in Maryland. You can send them to our Maryland Conservation Advocate, Angie McCarthy. If you're in Virginia, you can send them to our Virginia Conservation Advocate, Renee Grebe. And finally, it's very important to us that everyone is able to access programs such as this, because we think this information and this knowledge everyone needs to know. But creating this is not free. And so we welcome your support if you are able and willing to donate to keeping programs like this going. And then last but not least, the last plug of the night, Denise. All right. Nature Forward is holding its 6th Taking Nature Black conference in March of this year, March 5th through the 8th. We're going to have really dynamic speakers, such as Reverend Lennox Yearwood from the Hip Hop Caucus, Wawa Gataru from Black Girl Environmentalists, the author of Black Faces, White Spaces, Dr. Carolyn Finney, are all going to be speaking at our conference this year on reclaiming the environmental narrative and really building resilience in the face of climate change. We have so much that we're working for and fighting against. And so it's really important that we renew ourselves and renew our minds. And so we encourage you to register today for Taking Nature Black. And sign up for our action alerts. Denise just dropped the link in the chat along with the advocate emails. So with that, we're at 8:29, and thank you everyone for coming, for joining us, and we look forward to advocating with you in Virginia and Maryland's General Assembly. Have a good night.